Thomas Kwan's dark plan, the twist behind what he was owed, true crime documentary. The air was thick with tension. The street was empty, save for the flickering streetlights. Thomas Kwan stood at the corner. His eyes scanned the shadows. The dim glow of the nearby neon signs offered little comfort. His breath came in shallow bursts. His pulse echoed in his ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. The plan, his plan, was supposed to unfold with precision. But something felt off. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing sense of unease. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the briefcase he gripped. The weight of it seemed too heavy now. Too real. The whispers from earlier that day returned. He had heard them, faint and urgent. But he had brushed them aside. Now they clawed at his mind. His footsteps were muffled against the wet pavement. The sound of distant traffic, a low hum in the background, did nothing to quell the growing sense of dread. It was supposed to be simple. Just a few moves. A couple of men. And then the money. But as Thomas reached the alley, his body froze. He wasn't alone. There, under the rusted fire escape, stood a figure. Tall. Shrouded in the shadow of the building. His heart pounded. Was this the man he had been waiting for? The man who owed him everything? The man who had promised him so much? Thomas could feel his palms growing clammy. His eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of the figure in front of him. But the shadows made it difficult. The air around him felt colder now. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Thomas instinctively took a step back. But the figure kept coming. Closer. Closer. Until the chill in the air was unbearable. He could hear the soft scrape of boots against the pavement now. Each step seemed louder, more pronounced. And then the figure spoke. A voice that sent a shiver down his spine. Did you think it would be this easy? Thomas's mouth went dry. The voice was familiar, but wrong. The sound of it twisted his insides. For a moment, he stood frozen. The weight of the briefcase almost unbearable now. Something wasn't right. The figure was too still. Too composed. Thomas took a step back, but his legs felt like lead. The air seemed to press in on him. And then, there was a sound. A loud crack, like a gunshot. Thomas jerked back, his breath catching in his throat. But the figure didn't flinch. He didn't even move. Instead, he smiled. A twisted grin that stretched too wide. And then the world went dark. The darkness was suffocating. It wrapped around him like a shroud. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the more he tried, the more it slipped away. He could feel the cold concrete beneath him. His back pressed against something hard. Something sharp. A low hum echoed through his skull. His fingers twitched, trying to move, but his limbs felt like stone. The weight of the briefcase was gone. Where was it? Panic surged through him. He tried to scream, but the air had been stolen from his lungs. His eyes strained, but there was nothing, just endless oppressive black. Then, the light flickered. A weak, pale glow pierced through the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make out the outline of the figure who had been standing before him. But now, it was crouching. Right in front of him. Too close. Too close. Thomas's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His heart thundered in his chest. And then the voice again. Did you really think you could come here, and take what wasn't yours? The words echoed in his head like a hammer, each one driving deeper. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing Thomas's cheek. Cold. Too cold. You're not getting out of this, Thomas. Thomas recoiled, the shock of the touch sending a jolt through his body. His hand shot up, as if to defend himself. But the figure was faster. It gripped his wrist in a vice-like hold. And the pain. The sharp, unrelenting pain, cut through his entire arm. The grip tightened, and Thomas gasped, the air stabbing his lungs like broken glass. His vision blurred. Everything seemed to tilt. The voice, soft now, like a whisper in his ear. You should have stayed away. But now you're part of the plan. Whether you like it or not. The figure let go of his wrist. For a brief moment, Thomas felt a rush of freedom. But then something colder, darker, gripped his throat. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His hands clawed at the air, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness. And that voice. The money was never yours, Thomas. You were just a pawn. And then, nothing. The world went silent. A deafening, consuming silence. Thomas's vision swam in and out of focus. His pulse hammered in his temples. He tried to scream, but his throat was crushed under an invisible weight. The grip on his throat tightened further, squeezing the last remnants of air from his lungs. His chest burned. Desperation flooded him. With what little strength he had left, he shoved, pushed against the unseen force holding him. But it didn't budge. A sharp, wet sound echoed in the dark. He couldn't tell if it was coming from him, or from somewhere else entirely. Then, a low guttural laugh. It made his skin crawl. Foolish, the voice hissed. Did you really think you could outsmart us? You're not owed anything. The darkness around him shifted. For the first time, he felt something else. Something cold slide against his skin. Something metallic. Thomas's eyes shot open, but all he saw was a blurred figure standing over him. A figure that wasn't human anymore. It was distorted. A silhouette that didn't make sense. It moved in jerks, like something out of a nightmare. It came closer. Closer still. And then, in a sickening whisper, it spoke again. You thought you were clever, Thomas. But you've played the game wrong. A harsh, breathy chuckle followed. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a dark realization clawing at his mind. The money. It wasn't about the money at all. It never had been. He wasn't a player in this game. He was the sacrifice. He was the pawn meant to be crushed. The briefcase. The plan. All of it, just pieces in a much larger scheme. A scheme that was beyond his understanding. Beyond his control. Your debt was never to be paid, the voice said, its tone now chillingly calm. You were always meant to fail. Thomas tried to move, to fight back, but his limbs betrayed him. The world around him swirled. His body felt lighter, like he was floating, suspended in nothingness. And then, just as suddenly, he was falling. Falling through the blackness. Faster, faster. He reached out, trying to grasp something. But there was nothing. Nothing to stop him. The void stretched endlessly. And then, the light. A bright, blinding light. It hit him with force. His vision exploded in a burst of searing white. His body jerked violently. He gasped for air, but it was no use. The world had already slipped from his grasp. And in that moment he knew, he would never escape. Not now. Not ever. The light burned his eyes. Piercing, like 1,000 needles. He tried to close them, but they wouldn't obey. He couldn't blink. Couldn't look away. The light wrapped around him, choking the very air from his lungs. His body convulsed in shock. And then it stopped. Everything went still. Too still. For a moment, there was nothing. No light, no sound, no pain. Just a heavy, suffocating silence. And then a cold breeze stirred the air. A whisper. So faint, he almost missed it. Welcome back, Thomas. The voice came from nowhere, and everywhere. It slithered around him, filling his mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. He tried to move, but his limbs were like lead, frozen to the ground. His skin crawled. He felt exposed. Vulnerable. He wanted to scream. To beg for answers. But the words were stuck. Stifled, as if the very act of speaking was forbidden. Did you think you were the only one who made a plan? The voice mocked, dark and taunting. You were never meant to win. Thomas's mind raced, trying to process the words. Plan? What plan? He couldn't remember anything clearly. The memory of the figure, its twisted grin, the cold touch, flashed in his mind like a broken film reel. Something wasn't right. Everything wasn't right. The shadows around him stirred again. Shapes began to form. Figures. Not human. Not quite. They moved in the periphery of his vision, too fast to focus on. Just out of reach. He could hear whispers, more than one voice now. Too many to understand. But the tone was unmistakable. They were mocking him. He clenched his fists. Desperation surged, tearing at him from the inside. His mind was trapped, but his body still reacted. His fingers twitched. A sharp gasp tore through his throat. He was breathing again. A cold, ragged breath. And then he saw them. The figures fully formed, emerging from the dark corners of his vision. Shapes, cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured. They moved toward him, their footsteps silent, but he could feel them, feel their presence closing in. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest. He could taste the fear in the air. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. One of the figures stepped forward, its form shifting unnaturally. A jagged silhouette, stretching and contracting. It reached out with hands that were too long, too many fingers. And when it spoke, its voice shattered his sanity. "You were always part of the plan, Thomas." The darkness seemed to thicken around him, crushing him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't think. "You were never going to walk away," the figure said, its voice cold and hollow. "The game is over." And then, everything went black again. But this time, it felt final. Like the end of something. Something irreversible. Something eternal. The blackness was absolute. Like being submerged in an endless void, where even the concept of time ceased to exist. No sound. No light. Nothing. Thomas's mind raced in the dark, fragments of thoughts colliding with each other. What had just happened? What were those things? The words, their chilling words, echoed in his skull like a persistent drumbeat. "You were never going to walk away." He tried to fight it, tried to force himself awake. But there was no escape. Nothing he could do. A sudden pulse of cold swept through him, like ice running through his veins. His entire body stiffened, as if the dark itself was seizing him. Then, the whispers returned. Faint at first, just an undercurrent. But they grew louder, clearer. A chorus of voices, many voices. Some he recognized. Others, he didn't. Each one was dripping with malice. "Thomas," they crooned, "did you really think you could cheat the game?" Another voice, this one sharp and angry, sliced through the others. "You weren't owed anything." The voices swirled around him, closing in, tightening. He could feel their presence pressing on him, suffocating him. But then, a shift. The blackness split. Like a curtain pulled back from the stage. Light. Blinding, pure light. It wasn't the same as before. This time, it wasn't painful. But it was wrong. It felt unnatural. His eyes slowly adjusted. And what he saw made his stomach lurch. He was no longer in the alley. No longer on the street. He was standing in an open room, vast and cavernous, its walls stretching endlessly, like a nightmare that defied geometry. The air was thick, stagnant, almost suffocating. At the far end of the room, a single figure stood in the shadows. The one from before. The one with the twisted grin. It was still wearing that same dark smile. "Welcome back," the figure said, its voice soft, almost playful. Thomas stumbled back, his feet tripping over nothing. The coldness in the room seeped into his bones. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat louder than the last. The figure stepped forward, slowly, the shadows clinging to its form like it was part of the darkness itself. "Did you think this was all just about money?" it asked, its tone laced with mockery. "You were never owed anything, Thomas." He wanted to speak, to demand answers. But his mouth was dry, his throat constricted. "You never had a choice," the figure continued, circling around him now, its presence overwhelming. "You were just another piece on the board." Thomas's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, any way out of this nightmare. But there was nowhere to go. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, everything was part of the same oppressive blackness. The figure moved closer, closer still. And then it stopped, its face now inches from his own. He could feel its cold breath on his skin. The grin widened, stretching unnaturally. "You were meant to fail, Thomas," it whispered. "And you did." Everything around him seemed to close in, the darkness pressing harder, the walls seeming to shrink. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Nothing at all. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him again was that smile. That twisted, knowing smile. The darkness swallowed him whole. A suffocating silence followed. It was as though he was floating, drifting through nothingness. No walls. No floor. Just an endless void. But then, something changed. A faint, distant sound. A soft clicking. Like the ticking of a clock, but slow, deliberate. Each tick sent a shiver crawling up his spine. He couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to come from everywhere. And then, a whisper. So quiet, so faint, he almost missed it. "Time's up, Thomas." His blood ran cold. The tick of the clock grew louder. Closer. More urgent. And then, something else. A flicker. Just a flash. A brief image, almost too quick to catch. A face. A woman's face. Her eyes, wide, unblinking, stared at him. Frozen. Staring right through him. Her lips didn't move, but her voice echoed in his head. "You think you're the only one trapped here?" The image disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving Thomas to struggle in the dark once more. His breath quickened. The ticking grew louder, pounding like a drum in his skull. Another flicker. Another face. This time, a man. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets. The man's mouth opened, but no words came. Only a horrible, rasping breath. Thomas's chest tightened. His pulse quickened. Was this another part of the plan? Was this some twisted game too? "Everyone's a pawn here," the man's voice whispered in his mind. The flickering faces, too many now to count, blurred together in flashes of agony, of fear, of pleading. Each one speaking in turn, but not in words. Only thoughts. Thoughts that collided with his own. And then, everything went still. For a moment, there was only silence. But not the comforting kind. The kind that stung. That made you wonder if you were truly alone. And then, a new sound. A low guttural growl. From the depths of the darkness. Something primal. Something hungry. It was moving closer. Closer to him. The air grew thick with tension. He could feel its presence. The weight of it pressed against him. And then something cold and wet touched his arm. He recoiled, his body jerking back. But it didn't stop. The coldness spread, crawling up his skin, like fingers wrapping around his flesh. He couldn't move. His limbs were locked. Frozen in place. The growl grew louder. Closer. And then he felt it. A sharp, searing pain. Like claws sinking into his skin. Tearing him open. Thomas screamed. But there was no sound. No voice. Only a silent, tortured scream that rang in his mind. And then, everything went black again. But this time he knew. It was final. There was no coming back. The blackness pressed in like a vice, suffocating him, but there was no escape. His thoughts, scrambled, fragmented, fought to piece together what was happening, but everything slipped through his fingers. The pain, though, lingered. Not in his body, no, not anymore, but in his mind. It was a cold, gnawing ache that spread through every part of him, deep and unrelenting. The growl had faded, but its echo lingered in his ears, vibrating through his skull. The silence returned. This time, it felt different. Not empty. No, it was thick. Heavy. It pressed down on him, making it harder to breathe. But even in the thickest of silences, he could feel the presence of something. Something watching him. Listening. Waiting. He tried to move, to break free, but his body refused. He felt paralyzed. The darkness around him was absolute, yet his mind raced. Memories flickered in and out, faces, places, conversations. He remembered the alley, the briefcase, the plan. But now, it all seemed so distant. So irrelevant. His chest tightened, and he realized, he wasn't a lone star. There was something else. A low hum filled the air, subtle at first, but growing louder. Like an electric current pulsing through the dark. Something was moving. Something was close. He tried to speak. His lips parted, but no sound came. Not even a whisper. The hum intensified. And then, he felt it again. Cold. Sharp. Something touched his skin. This time, it wasn't a fleeting sensation, it stuck. It clung to him like an icy hand, wrapping around his neck. Squeezing. The air was stolen from his lungs. His heart hammered in his chest. The pressure built, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, panic surged through him. The blackness shifted. Something moved within it, slithering through the void like a predator circling its prey. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. He tried to scream, to fight back, but his limbs were frozen, his body paralyzed. The coldness around his neck tightened. Tighter. Tighter. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't. A sharp crack echoed through the void. The pressure snapped. And in that moment, he gasped. Air. Real air. But it was cold. Too cold. His eyes opened wide, but the world around him was still nothing but dark shadows, shapes, fleeting forms. The growl returned, closer this time. Louder. A shudder ran through his body. But then, something different. A faint light flickered in the distance. Weak. Uncertain. It was the same as before, the flickering light he had seen during his descent into darkness. But this time, there was something more. He wasn't alone. In the light, he saw shadows moving. Figures. Not the twisted faces from before, but something else. Something human. A faint whisper rose from the darkness, * a name star. Thomas. A voice. His name. But it wasn't the same as before. This voice, it was familiar. Faint. Distant. But real. For the first time, a sense of clarity seeped through the fog. He wasn't in control of this. He had never been. The figures in the light drew closer. And the growl, the pain, the fear, it all shifted. It became something else. Something darker. Something final. The light flickered once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't fading. It was growing. The shadows recoiled, retreating from it like roaches from the sun. And then, the figure emerged. It wasn't the twisted grin. Not the thing that had mocked him. No, this was something else. The person was standing just outside the light, just at the edge of his vision. And it was watching him. Silent. Waiting. The pain in his chest surged again, but this time, it felt different. It felt real. The growl in the distance stopped. And for the first time since he had entered this nightmare, Thomas could hear his own breath. Shallow. Rapid. He forced himself to look up at the figure. It was a man. Dressed in a dark coat, face obscured by shadow. And the moment their eyes met, everything changed. The room, the shadows, the oppressive weight of it all. It all shifted. And in that moment, Thomas knew. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The moment their eyes locked, everything snapped into focus. Thomas felt the weight in his chest shift, the air growing heavier as the figure in the darkness stepped closer. But it wasn't the cold that made him shiver now. No, it was the presence of the man in front of him. This was different. He was different. The shadows that had been pressing in on Thomas receded, like they were afraid to approach the figure. The light around him was dim but growing, flickering like an uncertain flame, but it was real. Real in a way Thomas could feel in his bones. He tried to move, but his body still refused to obey. The figure spoke. The voice was low. Familiar. Did you think it would end any other way? Thomas's breath hitched. He couldn't reply. The words burned in his chest, scraping his insides. The voice carried an edge of something ancient, something knowing. You were never meant to escape, Thomas. You were always a part of this. A part of this. The words echoed in his head like an open wound. His mind raced. He had to remember. He had to understand. Who was this man? Why did he feel familiar? The figure's face was still obscured by shadow, but something about the way he stood, something in the way he moved, made Thomas feel as though he had seen him before. The pieces of the puzzle scattered across his mind began to fit together in jagged fragments. The plan. The debt. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about revenge. It was all about control. This whole time, Thomas had been playing a game he didn't even understand. The game had always been about him. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. You never had a choice, the man continued, his voice like cold steel. You were always meant to fail. And now, you've come full circle. The darkness in the room seemed to pulse with life, moving in time with the man's words. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. His mind screamed for clarity. But there was none. The figure stepped closer, and as he did, the room seemed to close in again. It was too late. You should have stayed away, Thomas. Now, you'll be like the others. A piece in the game. Forever. The light flickered one last time. And just as everything began to shatter, Thomas understood. The game was never about getting what he was owed. It was about being trapped. And in that moment he knew. He would never leave. Never. The air grew still, thick with a finality that Thomas could not escape. He stood there, frozen, as the figure before him stepped closer. Each footfall was deliberate, measured, yet it echoed with an ominous finality. The weight of the man's presence was suffocating, almost tangible. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest, but even his pulse seemed to slow. It was as if time itself was collapsing inward, stretching out every second into an eternity of unbearable tension. The shadows no longer crept, they surrounded him, consumed him. The man's voice, once cold and detached, now took on an almost mournful tone. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Thomas blinked, unsure of what to make of the question. His mind swam in the darkness, the disjointed pieces of his past, the fleeting memories, the twisted faces, everything clashed together like thunder in a storm. "What do you mean?" Thomas whispered, his throat raw, the words barely escaping. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his silhouette shifting within the dim light. "You were never meant to understand it, Thomas," the man said finally, his words almost soft. "This is the price for your ignorance. For your greed." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Price. His mind was reeling. He tried to focus, to find some thread of logic in the madness that had enveloped him. But the truth was just beyond his grasp, slippery, like water between his fingers. The man's eyes gleamed from the darkness, not cruel, but pitying. "You wanted to get what you were owed," he continued, the faintest trace of a sad smile on his lips. "But in this game, Thomas, what you're owed is never what you think it is." Thomas wanted to scream, to break free, to fight back. But the more he struggled, the heavier the weight on his chest became. It was too late for answers. Too late for regrets. The man reached out, his hand hovering just inches from Thomas's face. "You were always a part of this," he said, voice soft but final. And then, with a quiet shift, the darkness folded in. Everything went still. The shadows, the cold, the oppressive weight of the unknown, all of it vanished. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas could breathe. But he wasn't free. He was never meant to be. As the silence wrapped around him, Thomas understood. The game wasn't over. It had never been. And now, he was part of it. Forever. In the end, he was never owed anything. Not even the truth.